Hello guys, Garcia here, and today we will talk about The Frankenstein Diaries, a horror book written by Mr. Hubert Venables, or Venables, and published in 1980. Obviously, this book is one of the many reimaginings of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, one of, if not the biggest horror classic of all time. It's a simpler and more focused version of the story, and is actually a collection of notes, drawings, and diary entries produced by Victor Frankenstein himself while he was alive. Hundreds of years later, these manuscripts were received by Mr. Venables, the author of the book, and he organized them coherently to tell the world about the extraordinary life of Dr. Frankenstein. I am not going to compare this version with the other versions of the story during this video. I will only talk about this particular book. The first half of this video is going to be mostly spoiler free, and the second part will contain spoilers, so if you get interested in reading the book, don't worry, I will warn you before the real spoiler starts. The book starts with Mr. Venables receiving a package from a friend containing German manuscripts from the 18th century. He keeps them for years, and after he retires from his clerical duties, he is a reverend. He opens the package and starts translating the German notes. He realizes that he has something absolutely extraordinary in his hands, and he starts organizing the notes and researching the Frankenstein family and historical records to confirm that the manuscripts are legitimate. His conclusion is that they are, and after pondering for a while if he should publish this book or not, because most of its contents are expressing ideas and situations that affront directly his beliefs and morals, but he decides to do so. He felt that the themes and dilemmas within are way too important to be stashed again somewhere, and he feels like other people should have the opportunity to read it and judge its contents. As you can see, this book treats the diary of the Doctor as a historical account of his life, and that's very interesting, because all we have are the diary entries, some of Victor's drawings, and some notes provided by Hubert. So we have to trust Dr. Frankenstein's descriptions, memories, and records of his adult life, and that gets really difficult to do after a while, because he becomes less and less reliable as a narrator as time goes on. Hubert contextualizes the manuscripts a bit, talking about the origins of the influent Frankenstein family, its roots in Geneva, Switzerland, and Victor Frankenstein's childhood as a prodigy in many fields, needing particular lessons from great tutors to develop his talents. When he was 18, his mother died of scarlet fever, and that impacted him immensely, but his curiosity and desire to learn eventually led him to enter the University of Ingolstadt in Germany. There, he started the journey that would eventually lead him to madness. This is my favorite horror book of all time, and the main reason for that is not the creature and its creation actually, but rather Victor Frankenstein himself. What an interesting and tragic character he is. The narrative follows mostly the same pattern of many retellings of the Frankenstein story, with Victor initially being a prodigy that has these amazing observational and analytical skills, but also a hyper-inflated ego that drives him forward to undertake some sort of divine task that only a man of his intellect could execute. And after following this road for long enough, he gets traumatized during his failed experiments and decides to approach life in a different way. However, after the main elements of this new and fulfilling life are taken away forever, he corrects the course of his existence and decides to dedicate himself to what he believes is his purpose: to defeat death by obtaining the ability to create human life. He believed that eventually immortality would be achieved, and no one would have their existence cut short ever again. But the mental gymnastics he performs during the story are gold medal worthy. He is able to rationalize basically all of his choices and actions, no matter how immoral or unethical they are, because he sees himself as the chosen one, the man handpicked by God to give God's own divine gift to mankind, the spark of life, or the vital impulse. He doesn't aspire to become a god or replace God himself. He wants parity, the same ability to generate a living being that God has. He talks a lot about God, purpose, and the devil in his writings. Faith and mysticism were still very much connected to the scientific process in the 18th century, and concepts like auras, vital energy, and souls were still used in rational discussions and studies. During the story, Victor is constantly forced to confront his failed dreams, his fears, and his regrets, and he falls in a deep depression because of it. He starts calling these emotions and his posterior visions demons, sent from the devil himself, trying to manipulate him to make him abandon his purpose and give up on it all. His mental decay is as scary as the creature himself, and his metaphorical demons, at times, feel more threatening to him than his real-world problems could ever be. Victor also writes a lot about scientific concepts, his laboratory, his machines, and the progress or lack thereof of his experiments. They are detailed enough to feel realistic, but not enough to make you feel lost thanks to complicated terms and scientific lingo. They contribute a lot to reinforce the fact that the book is historically accurate, that it is the personal account of a doctor that really achieved a supreme scientific achievement, not because of some sort of magical solution, but because he was able to develop a unique scientific method of breathing new life into a dead body. It's a somber story that deals with pretty heavy topics constantly. Several atrocities happen along the way, and the main character is at best a morally questionable tortured soul, and at worst a jigsaw-type psychopath that will use every tool available to fulfill his ambitions, only to suffer the terrible consequences of his actions with no real redemption in sight. So before we start the second half of the video, why should you read this book? Several reasons. One, because of the diary entries and the way the story is told. The book is very short, being only 170 pages long, so you can finish it in one sitting. Two, Victor's drawings are displayed every other page to illustrate places, machines, tools, the human anatomy, and the creature, so you will have his descriptions, but also a lot of images selected by Hubert to show us what exactly Victor was working with centuries ago. 3 is a less complex and more horror-focused story than the original one. There's way less philosophical questions and interpersonal drama. The story is contained in mostly one location, and there's less characters too. So if you want a simpler Frankenstein story, this one is for you. And 4, this is actually scary. Being mostly comprised of Victor's personal accounts of events, the book is a series of fragments of what actually happened, and imagining what happened in the days he didn't write can lead your mind to very uncomfortable places. So if you're interested, go and check it out. It's awesome. Thank you for watching this far, and I'll see you in the next one. Now, in the second part, there will be spoilers, so this is your warning. So let's do it. I am not going to go through the entire book in this section, otherwise this video would be 4 hours long. So what I did was to choose several of my favorite parts to discuss them with you guys. One heads up before I start, I am using a Portuguese version that I have as a base, so something might be lost in translation, and names and terms might not correspond to the ones present in the English version, so I apologize if that happens. The first one is the first really horrific occurrence that Victor experiences while doing his research in the universe of Ingolstadt. He was allowed to use the facilities and perform experiments by himself, thanks to Professor Waldman, a chemist that noticed his potential instantly when he started his academic journey. He reaches the point in his research in which he needs to experiment on a dead fetus, stimulating it with the three forces that are, in his opinion, essential to give what he calls the initial impulse to a dead body: electricity, magnetism, and ethereal sound, which is basically a specific sound frequency he needs to produce. He does that, and hours go by with no changes. He ends up sleeping for a few hours, and when he wakes up, he notices that the fetus basically became a horribly bloated and deformed, pulsating ball of flesh, and he panics, turns the table, and throws the creature on the floor, where it explodes. That traumatizing experience changed everything for him and forced him to abandon his studies, starting a very long process of recovery that would eventually lead him to return home alongside his best friend, Henry Clerval. There's actually a drawing in the book of this horrible creature, and can you imagine looking at something like this in the 18th century, let alone creating it? That creature is the complete opposite of what he was trying to do. So Victor almost went completely insane, and only when he goes back home and meets Elizabeth, he returns to his normal life. They get married, and his life was almost perfect until Elizabeth dies in their honeymoon. I really like the fact that he didn't write anything in his diary about the boat accident they had in the lake before coming back home to visit William, his younger brother, who was very sick. Hubert says in the book that he pieced together what happened using old newspapers, but Victor himself never wrote about that later on. So we are left to wonder if what happened that day was the story that Hubert was able to ascertain via his research, or did something more sinister happen and Victor just kept it to himself until his death. Knowing who he was, it's a real possibility. He only mentions her death in his diary once, 2 days later, and I think he only mentions her name only one more time by the end of the book, because he has a horrible nightmare involving her and the creature. He goes back home to see his younger brother agonizing in bed, and he almost feels envious of him because of the fact that he's going to the place that Elizabeth went to, and Victor won't be able to go there for many years. This is basically him cursing the fact that he can't kill himself to go see Elizabeth in the afterlife because he is a Christian. So if he kills himself, he will be sent to hell and he will never meet her again. So he is going to have to wait for many years to come, alone. After William's death, he leaves the house and never returns again. With the help of his brother Ernest, he starts searching for the Frankenstein's ancestral home in Germany, a ruined castle called Schorstein, built in a remote location surrounded by a forest, in which he could proceed with his experiments without being bothered by anybody. The fact that he chose an abandoned castle is obviously perfect, is a fantastic setting for a horror story, and is the perfect place to conduct ethically questionable experiments, and the darkness and remoteness would only be amplified at night. Add to that a furious monster walking around, and you can start to imagine what Victor went through during his final days. After he finished setting up his laboratory in the castle, he wrote this in his diary: "All the threads of creativity will be united in me, and once freed from the claws of mortality, man will be able to walk the earth in God's company." That's the parity I was talking about before, to enable humans to overcome mortality to be closer to God. He believes now that this is a duty that was imposed on him by God, so he basically is now a twisted pope, a representative that must enlighten mankind's path to a better future. He hasn't even started his main experiments yet, and he already lost it. That's a very dangerous man right there. Another great part of the book is when Victor almost succeeds for the first time. The first creature awakens during the night, terrifying his assistant Igor in the process. So he runs downstairs to the lab, and the creature in the operating table is vocalizing horrifying screams while his mouth and eyes are completely opened. Victor thinks about it and decides to turn off the machines that kept the creature alive because he realized that the pain this being was feeling was probably caused by the fact that its brain awakened, but it was confined to an inert and lifeless body. Yes, you understood it correctly. Victor's machines and experiments were partially successful, but only the brain returned to life, while the body was still dead. That's the ultimate version of being a prisoner of your own body. Those screams were the manifestation of the pain and despair of a person brought back to life in a failed experiment that instantly felt untold amounts of pain when they woke up trapped in a dead body. If a scientist doesn't stop their experiments after this, there's no humanity left in him. Victor obviously decides to try again, but this time he's going to use the brain of a very young child, because kids that age have little to no sense of self-awareness and are not mentally developed enough to feel or understand the consequences of awakening in a new body. He wants a blank canvas, a brain that will develop alongside the rest of the body and will accept this cursed existence. As you can see, Victor stopped caring completely about other people, laws, ethics, standards of behavior, and any other restraint that could possibly slow him down. Now, as long as the goal is reached, all of his actions will be justified in the eyes of God, and he will be seen as the savior of mankind. Later on in the book, the real creature, the one who has the child's brain, awakens, and Victor's eyes meet with its eyes for the very first time, and he feels conflicted. He is amazed, bewildered, and terrified at the same time. He sees the darkness of an empty mind, the pathway to an eternity beyond, and for a fleeting moment, the seed of hell, imprisoned in a torn carcass. If he had learned his lesson, he would have killed his creation right then and there. He struggles constantly with his own perception of the creature since the beginning. The most terrifying aspect of this story is how his perception of the creature makes him blind to the threat that the creature's existence poses to mankind. Initially, he wants to call it Dionysus, like the Greek god that was dismembered and rebuilt, but he ends up calling it creature. Only later on, after he already lost control of the situation and several people are dead, he calls it a monster. And by the end, when he decides to stop feeding the creature, admitting that he no longer feels any compassion for it, he calls it the son of Satan. And now he sees himself as the instrument of the destruction of mankind, not of its salvation. When he starts to lose his authority over the creature and decides to keep it locked in the chambers below the laboratory, the first question the reader wants to ask is, why didn't he leave it there and just escaped while it was still possible? There are several reasons, I think. First, it's his life's work. If he felt the situation could be reversed eventually, why would he leave? Second, he felt it's his responsibility to keep the creature imprisoned so it couldn't escape to the outside world. Third, run away to where? He lost everybody that mattered in his life, and only his work remained. So he would be alive in a distant place, but his soul would be dead. And the fourth is more debatable, but I think it is plausible. He probably felt that that was his punishment for daring to imitate God, to see his paladin, his own Adam, slowly but surely becoming an agent of failure and destruction. Moments like the death of Igor, the final confrontation, and when the creature breaks the wall of the pantry to escape are terrifying enough, but one moment stands above all others, and if you read the book, you know the one I mean. As I said before, at a certain point in the story, Victor locks up the creature in the chambers below the laboratory because he no longer has control over it, and it tried to escape several times already. So he builds a makeshift cart and prepares a chemical solution to drug the creature and take it to the laboratory, fearing for the creature's life. He knocks on the door and calls it, but doesn't hear anything. He gets in very slowly and carefully because the creature is very aggressive towards him now, and he knows it might kill him and escape if he's not careful. The antechamber is empty, so he moves on to the next room, and he sees human remains scattered on the ground, and the creature squatting down in a corner with its back turned to him, slowly rocking from side to side. The creature notices him, turns around, and a horrified Victor notices that it is carrying what could better be described as a makeshift human being. It had a decomposing head of a young woman and limbs that were held together by a string. Victor instantly runs away, locking the door behind him. He then tries to look for a rational explanation for what just happened. The creature probably escaped, killed several people outside, and brought back the cadavers to try to replicate what was done to it. It acted on instinct, trying to reproduce the only way it knew how, to combine parts of cadavers into a singular body to create a new being, the most twisted baby to ever exist. I first read this book when I was 13 years old, 20 years ago, and to this day, I still vividly remember the images my brain showed me when I tried to visualize this whole scene. It's poetic, brutal, impressive, depressing, and upsetting, and it terrifies me to this day to think what else could this creature be thinking or planning if it could come up with something like this. And if you think about it, the way Victor reacted to the monster's creation is probably the same way society would react to Victor's own creature. So it was a situation that created an interesting role reversal and showed us that even Dr. Frankenstein himself had his own psychological limits. And finally, let's talk about the ending. When the situation with the creature became truly dangerous for him, Frankenstein sent a letter to his brother Ernest, asking for his help, without explaining in detail what went down. His brother reaches the castle sometime later and finds his notes and the laboratory where Victor and the creature both lie dead after a final confrontation. Victor apparently let the creature in and dumped acid on it, while the creature absolutely destroyed his body in the ensuing fight. Ernest opens the tent, covering one of the operating tables, and he sees what's left of his brother's destroyed body, with his crushed chest still moving up and down, and a bunch of filaments that are connected to the machines in the lab still connected to his body. After reading Victor's notes, he finally understands what caused this morbid scene and decides to remove all of the filaments out of his brother's body, even after Victor opened his eyes and projected an unintelligible noise out of his crushed jaw. Victor finally dies, and his brother takes the notes with him and burns down the castle. Truly a fitting end to an extraordinarily brilliant and flawed individual. This is a very short book with a bunch of drawings, but it still manages to leave a lasting impression, and 20 years later, I can confirm it is still my all-time favorite. I strongly recommend it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.